Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's lecture. It's the last monthly lecture of the academic year, and we are very, very pleased that it's by one of our fellows who has spent the entire academic year here, Professor Jyotirmaya Sharma, who is a professor of political science at the University of Hyderabad. The lecture is part of the project which he has been following here at the IWM, entitled A Genealogy of Hindu Identity. He's written already 3 books on the subject. This is the 4th, so it forms a quartet. And this one is devoted to the work of Gandhi, looking at ideas of violence and non-violence. I mean, normally one would associate Gandhi with non-violence rather than violence, but he's looking at these ideas in Gandhi's work and looking at the representations of violence in the work, and this is where the exchange with Buber plays an interesting role, which he has chosen as the subject of his talk this evening. The earlier volumes have been on, I think the Govalkar volume is titled Terrifying Vision, and it has, in a way, a very direct link with the argument Tim Snyder was making here a couple of weeks ago, which is to say we really need to take right-wing ideologies as political thought seriously and to study them with the same attention we have been paying to left political theories, ideologies, for reasons both scholarly and political. And I think, in a sense, there is a very interesting parallel here between the project Tim Snyder has been following with regard to laying bare some of the ideological underpinnings of Putin's ideology and what Jyotirmaya has been doing with regard to taking the thought of the Hindu right extremely seriously. He's among the few scholars in India to have done this. And has been also misunderstood for his preoccupation with this, because often taking it seriously is read then as somehow wanting to be identified with this. At least it is read as anti-left thinking. But of course, so he has made neither friends on the left nor the right as a result, because his critique of Hindu right-wing thought has been a really, really trenchant critique, but a very sophisticated critique. The last book was on Vivekananda's thought, Cosmic Love and Human Apathy, Swami Vivekananda and the Restatement of Religion. He's also worked on topics like freedom, multiculturalism. The volume which he has edited there is called Grounding Morality, Freedom, Knowledge, and the Plurality of Cultures. This was published by Routledge in 2010. And his book, probably the one which has been translated into many Indian languages and for which he is best known, is his work on Hindutva, exploring the idea of Hindu nationalism. So he is looking at how both national identity in India has been reformulated through a certain reconceptualization of religion. So it's also how religion itself, how Hinduism itself gets reconceptualized during this period, and how Hindu nationalism as nationalist identity is formed in this process. Actually, Jyotirmaya has a long history of being a fellow. We would say he's quite a fellow. He's a fellow's fellow, because he has been a fellow at Uppsala, at SKAS, before he came to Vienna, and he has also been a fellow at the Lichtenberg Kolleg in Göttingen. And we don't know where this fellow pilgrimage is going to go next, but I hope the book has had a good productive time here, and we're looking forward to hear you on the Gandhi-Buber correspondence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shalini Randheria, for this characteristically generous introduction raises expectations. Thank you very much also for the time, the 10 months here, which were wonderful in terms of the quiet time one had away from the noise and chaos of Indian academic life to reflect and work on a restless man like Gandhi. Thank you all also for being here this evening. I'm deeply grateful to all of you for being here. The main title of this talk appears at the end of a letter Martin Buber wrote to Gandhi on 24th February 1939. You see, this is the last paragraph of that letter, which you have on the screen. It was an open letter, but was posted to Gandhi on March 9, 1939. Gandhi never replied. Why was Buber very slow in writing the letter? In a formal sense, it was because he did not want the letter to be overtly colored by two sentiments: an excessive preoccupation with self-preservation and the grievous error of collective egotism, a term Buber reserved for nationalism. But there were other compelling reasons that made the writing very slow. For Buber, Gandhi was a voice he had long known, long honored, thought of it as a great and earnest voice. Amidst all the voices, says Buber, it was a voice that commanded his attention. It was a voice that was capable of giving good counsel and genuine comfort. Why? Because Gandhi knew what suffering was, and so also knew that a sufferer requires true comforting more than good counsel. But what he hears now had very little to do with his peculiar circumstances, as Buber calls it. In fact, Gandhi's words were not applicable to him at all. Buber admits that the words were inspired by admirable general principles and the elements of a noble and most praiseworthy conception. But Gandhi had not looked at his situation. He had neither seen him, nor known him, nor was he aware of the dire straits under which he lived. Buber sees a third voice emerging. Along with counsel and comfort, he detects the voice of reproach. The man he honors was well within his rights to offer reproach, as long as the reproach was mixed with good counsel and true comfort. Then it would give the reproach a meaning and a reason. But Gandhi's voice was reproachful without being just. Buber felt the need to answer, especially because Jews were being persecuted, robbed, maltreated, and murdered. The third voice, the reproachful and unjust voice, came to Buber in the form of an article Gandhi wrote on November 20th, 1938. So this is after Munich and before March 1939. Subsequently published on November 26, 1938 in Harijan, a newspaper Gandhi edited. Titled "The Jews," the article was in response to letters from across the world asking Gandhi to offer his opinion on the Arab-Jew question in Palestine and on the persecution of Jews in Germany. At the outset, Gandhi clarifies that he had decided to write and offer his opinion with hesitation because these were very difficult questions. As one reads Gandhi's essay, two distinct themes emerge. The focus of my presentation this evening is primarily on the second theme and Buber's response to it. Despite conceding that the Jews had suffered persecution for ages, and despite his sympathy for them, Gandhi was categorically opposed to the call for a national home for Jews in Palestine. He believed that Palestine belonged to the Arabs, and it was inhuman to impose the Jews on the Arabs. Palestine of the biblical conception was not a geographical entity, it was something that remained in the hearts of the Jews, Gandhi says. Offering Palestine to the Jews was, in his eyes, a crime against humanity. This is the first theme, and I will skip any discussion around it. The second theme relates to the question of persecution of Jews in Germany. Gandhi begins by comparing Hitler to the tyrants of the past, but admits that the Führer had exceeded the permissible limits of such madness that tyrants are prone to. In Hitler, he saw a man driven by a religious zeal, furthering the cause of a new religion. This was the religion of exclusive and militant nationalism that legitimated and rewarded any act of inhumanity as humanity. The events in Germany were the crime of an obviously intrepid youth being inflicted upon the Germans with unbelievable ferocity. Was there then a justification for going to war with Germany in order to prevent the systematic and deliberate persecution of an entire race? If there ever could be a justifiable war in the name of and for humanity, writes Gandhi, war against Germany would be completely justified. End quote. For those familiar with Gandhi's antipathy to war and his commitment to nonviolence, this would momentarily come as a surprise. The reader, however, will soon realize that this was said rhetorically. Gandhi quickly distances himself from this position, stating that, and I quote, "I do not believe in any war. A discussion of the pros and cons of such a war is therefore outside my horizon or province." End quote. Having first approvingly stated the prevailing wisdom on war with Germany, and then rejecting it with alacrity in the same breath, Gandhi now launches into a discussion of violence and nonviolence. The German example, he argues, illustrates that violence can be worked more efficiently if it is not hampered by any hypocrisy or weakness masquerading as humanitarianism. And this is an obvious reference to the British colonial rule in India and its professed civilizing mission. But the German situation also shows that violence looks hideous, terrible, and terrifying in its nakedness. Turning to the Jews, he asks if there was a way to resist this organized and shameful persecution, a way that would preserve their self-respect and not render them helpless, neglected, and forlorn. Clearly, he believes there was a way out of their predicament. No person who has faith in a living God need feel helpless or forlorn, he says. The Jews attribute personality to God and believe that He rules every action of theirs. Having reaffirmed such faith, a Jew ought to claim Germany as his home and challenge any Gentile German who refuses or denies this claim to shoot him or send him to the dungeon. He ought to refuse to be expelled or submit to any form of discrimination. Neither should he wait for others to join him in this act of civil resistance. Others were bound to follow his example, Gandhi says in the end. Gandhi asserts that if an individual Jew or all Jews accepted his prescription, they cannot be worse off than in the condition they were at that point of time. Undergoing voluntary suffering will bring them inner strength and inner joy, something a war on Germany by Britain, France, and the US will never be able to give. Gandhi tries to anticipate Hitler's first reaction to a war against Germany and says that it would be in the form calculated violence resulting in a general massacre of the Jews. If the Jews could mentally prepare for voluntary suffering, the imaginary or putative massacre too could be turned into a day of thanksgiving and joy. This could be seen as a way of Jehovah bringing about the deliverance of a race, even at the hands of a tyrant. At this juncture, Gandhi breaks into a characteristic rhapsody about death. This has implications for my argument, so I quote it entirely. Quote, "For the God-fearing, death has no terror. It's a joyful sleep to be followed by a waking that would be all the more refreshing for the long sleep." End quote. The Jews in Germany had world opinion on their side, Gandhi says, and they were homogeneous, better educated, and gifted than the Indians who offered civil resistance under his leadership in South Africa. This made them eminently fit for offering Satyagraha or nonviolent resistance. He hoped that someone will rise in Germany among the Jews and lead them into nonviolent action, an act that could turn a degrading manhunt into a calm and determined stand offered by unarmed men and women possessing the strength of suffering given to them by God. It will be then a truly religious resistance offered against the godless fury of dehumanized man, he says. In choosing the way of nonviolence and nonviolent action, the Jews will vindicate their position on earth as a chosen people and lift from their heads the burden of being the outcasts of Christianity and of the Western world, concludes Gandhi. Just as an aside, in the case of when Gandhi is confronted with the cases of Arab excesses in Palestine, Gandhi again recommends Satyagraha, asking Jews to convert Arab hearts by offering themselves to be shot or thrown into the Dead Sea without raising a little finger against the Arabs. He wished that the Arabs had chosen the path of nonviolence, but says that this violence on the part of the Arabs, and I quote, was understandable according to the accepted canons of right and wrong. Did Gandhi alter any of these views after he'd written this essay in 1938? Writing in May 1939 issue of the Harijan, Gandhi expresses little need to change his opinion. Reacting to the suggestion that a Jewish Gandhi in Germany would probably function for 5 minutes and then taken to the guillotine, Gandhi feels that this only further cements his belief in ahimsa or nonviolence. He perceived the necessity of the immolation of hundreds, if not thousands, to appease the hunger of dictators who have no belief in ahimsa. He offers a maxim. Ahimsa, or nonviolence, is the most efficacious in front of the greatest himsa, violence. As for the results of practicing nonviolence, these ought not to be expected in one's lifetime. Writing on the question of nonviolence and its efficacy in 1939, he states that Hitler's heart must be made of a harder material than stone. But nonviolence had the capacity to generate enough heat for the hardest metal to melt. Later that year, Gandhi refused to distinguish between the democracies that he believed were based on violence, and he lists them, the US, Britain, France, and Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, or the Soviet Union. The only difference, Gandhi says, was that in Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union, the violence was better organized. In a letter dated June 1940 to Lord Linlithgow, Gandhi doubts if the Nazis were as bad as they were said to be, and asks him to follow nonviolence in order to confound Nazi ideas and arms. He says, a warrior survives on the strengths of his wars, whether offensive or defensive. Hitler would suffer a collapse if he found out that his warring capacity was unwanted when faced with nonviolent resistance. End quote. Later that year, writing in the Harijan, Gandhi felt that the thoroughness of the Nazi method makes some spiritual leaders in the world think that nothing but counter-violence can check terror. Counter-violence, Gandhi elaborates, can only lead to further brutalization of human nature. Nazi terror was a drastic disease and required drastic solutions. In this instance, nothing but non-violence can cure Nazi violence. In 1946, as late as 1946, Gandhi wrote, regretting that adversity had not taught the Jews the lesson of peace. They were relying on American money and British arms to impose themselves on Palestine through naked terrorism. Before I return to Buber's letter, I want to digress briefly. While Gandhi stated and restated his position on nonviolence all his life, and we find evidence of it in the 98 volumes of his collected works. There are actually 100 volumes, but the last two volumes are the appendices, 98 volumes, more than 50,000 pages. It would be useful to share what, in my mind, is his clearest formulation of what constitutes nonviolent resistance. In Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule, a text written by Gandhi in 1909, which he called his seminal text or his seed text, he calls nonviolent resistance love force and soul force, while arguing that the term passive resistance for Satyagraha, or nonviolent resistance, was not accurate. He argues that the force of arms is powerless when matched against the force of love or the soul. Satyagraha for Gandhi was a method of securing rights by personal suffering and is the reverse of resistance by arms. There is little courage required in blowing others to pieces from behind a cannon. Immense courage is required to approach a cannon with a smiling face and be blown to pieces. A nonviolent resistor is a true warrior, for, and I quote, he keeps death always as a bosom friend. That nation is great which rests its head upon death as its pillow. Those who defy death are free from all fear. End quote. So those who wanted to become nonviolent resistors then had to observe perfect chastity, adopt poverty, follow truth, and cultivate fearlessness. This is the status of nonviolent resistance as far as Gandhi's seed text goes. In my reading of the 98 volumes, I've just found one elaborate explanation for what he means by this fascination for death. But I'll come to this probably in the question-answer session. I'll go to Buber's letter now. Buber's letter, therefore, was a response not merely to the article written in 1938, but also to this entire constellation of ideas he knew well and had, till the moment that his peculiar circumstances had arisen, admired. Gandhi's article of November 26, writes Buber, amounted to nothing but tragicomic utterances born out of ignorance. Ignorance of the fact that synagogues and scrolls of the law were being burnt, sacred objects belonging to the entire community were being destroyed. But Gandhi was also completely ignorant about the reality of the concentration camp, its torments, and its methods of slow and quick slaughter. Neither could the plight of the Jews be compared to that of Indians in South Africa. This comparison could hardly be reduced to one of quality versus quantity. In the 5 years that Buber had spent under the Nazi regime, he recounts several instances of genuine nonviolent resistance or satyagraha by the Jews, instances that showed a strength of spirit and an absence of bartering of rights or any other form of capitulation. Jews who offered nonviolent resistance did not use force or cunning in order to escape the consequences of their action. Yet such actions did not exert even a slight influence on their oppressors. This experience of offering Satyagraha by the German Jews had led Buber to conclude that nonviolent resistance cannot become the watchword for the general behavior of all German Jews or indeed other oppressed people in the world. Buber does not outright reject the efficacy of nonviolence. He admits that nonviolence may prove to be, and I quote, an effective stand against unfeeling human beings in the hope of gradually and eventually hoping to bring them to their senses, end quote. But nonviolent resistance against the Nazi regime in Germany would be a futile act against what Buber calls a diabolic universal steamroller that cannot be withstood. There are situations, Buber says, in which no satyagraha of the power of the truth can result from the satyagraha of the strength of the spirit. Why was this so? And this to me is one of the most moving, follows is one of the most moving and agonized expression of Buber's reservations about Gandhi's advocacy of Satyagraha. He says, this is so because Satyagraha signifies testimony. The destiny, the fate that the Jews faced in Germany, Buber says, is testimony without acknowledgement, ineffective, unobserved martyrdom, a martyrdom cast to the winds. As the Jewish prayer says, God alone seals their testimony. It's futile to ask for such anonymous martyrdom. Going further, Buber quotes Gandhi to Gandhi himself, summoning to memory an earlier quote of Gandhi, earlier than the essay written in 1938, earlier quote of Gandhi, and calling it a very important pronouncement. Gandhi had stated elsewhere, and I quote, "Have I not repeatedly said that I would have India become free even by violence, rather than that she remain in bondage?" End quote. Buber interprets this as an assertion on Gandhi's part that nonviolence for him was an article of faith and not a political principle, that the desire for India's freedom was even stronger than his faith. For this, I love you, Buber says. Similarly, the Jews never wanted recourse to force and had always proclaimed the teaching of justice and peace. But the Jews had not declared the teachings of nonviolence as a non-negotiable and steadfast article of faith in the manner of Gandhi and of Jesus, the son of our own people. Because we believe that a man must sometimes use force to save himself, or even more, his children. Hence, Buber objects to Gandhi's suggesting that Jewish acts of nonviolence in Germany were that of the helpless and the weak. Great strength of spirit and genuine satyagraha had been practiced for years, despite ceaseless deeds of blind violence perpetrated without the oppressed answering with like deeds of blind violence. In his 1938 essay, Gandhi had called the Jews the untouchables of Christianity, and had drawn parallels between the treatment of untouchables by Hindus. He had also called upon the Jews to vindicate their position on earth by choosing nonviolence. Buber takes this on directly. He refers to the stigma against the Jews that their Jewish ancestors had crucified Jesus. Whether this actually happened or not, it is possible that it did happen, says Buber. It is also possible, he tells Gandhi, that there might arise circumstances where the Indian people might condemn Gandhi to death for his teachings, especially if they were to go against their prevailing tendencies. This despite the claim in the 1938 essay by Gandhi that India by nature is non-violent. In a remarkably prescient turn of phrase, Buber tells Gandhi that nations often swallow up the greatness to which they give birth. This bit about highlighting Gandhi's claim that India by nature is non-violent is Buber's way of also reminding Gandhi of his inconsistencies and contradictions. For elsewhere in the same letter, Buber has already reminded Gandhi what the Mahatma had said in 1922 after the failure of the first non-cooperation movement. I see that our non-violence is skin deep. This is Gandhi saying. I see that our non-violence is skin deep. This non-violence seems to be due merely to our helplessness. Can true voluntary non-violence come out of this seemingly forced non-violence of the weak? End quote. Buber tells Gandhi that when he read this, his reverence for Gandhi was born. A reverence so great that even Gandhi's present attitude of injustice and unjust reproach cannot destroy it. Having said that, Buber wonders if such actions in the past, the crucifying of Jesus, do indeed constitute a stigma. However these past actions were to be perceived, Buber makes his stand clear. He would not have been a crucifier of Christ, but also not be one of Christ's supporters. Why? And I quote, "For I cannot help withstanding evil when I see that it's about to destroy the good. I am forced to withstand evil in the world just as the evil within myself. I can only strive not to have to do so by force. I do not want force, but if there is no other way of preventing the evil destroying the good, I trust I shall use force and give myself up into God's hands." End quote. These are the reasons, Buber says, why I have been very slow in writing this letter to you, Mahatma. Before I conclude, there is one element from Buber's letter that I want to further elaborate and discuss, because it has considerable implications for the question of the efficacy of nonviolence. Recall Buber quoting Gandhi on the question of nonviolence and India's independence, something he interprets as nonviolence for Gandhi was an article of faith and not a political principle. This might lead to the conclusion that the efficacy of nonviolence is hampered by the mixing of faith and politics. Does Buber reach this conclusion also because he perceives Gandhi to be completely insouciant to his context, his peculiar circumstances, as he calls them, speaking to him in a voice of reproachful injustice that makes, Buber says, his heart palpitate? Buber's engagement with Gandhi's ideas predates the letter of February 1939. In a little-known essay titled Gandhi, Politics and Us, written in 1930, this is 8 or 9 years before this letter, Buber opens his narrative with the testimony of a British official regarding Gandhi's suspension of the non-cooperation movement in 1922. What was supposed to be a non-violent Satyagraha, non-violent civil resistance, turned violent in a place called Chauri Chaura, a small town in the Gorakhpur district of what were then the United Provinces. The British official writing about it said, and I quote, "What Gandhi undertook was the most powerful of all experiments that the history of the world has known, and only fell a little short of succeeding. But in him, the insight into human passion was lacking. End quote. While rejecting this analysis, Buber concludes that what Gandhi lacked was not insight into human passions, but rather the opposite, a readiness to exploit them. At this juncture, Buber quotes Gandhi extensively. Gandhi's admission that the riots in Chauri Chaura were a warning from God that there does not yet exist in India the truthful and non-violent atmosphere that alone can justify mass disobedience. More significantly, Buber quotes Gandhi saying that he was afraid of the monstrous majority he seemed to command. But if he, that is Gandhi, were to find himself in a hopeless minority of one, he would still have the courage to be in the position of being a minority, since it is the truthful position. This latter statement Buber hails as the statement of a truthful man and goes a step further, and I quote, "I know of nothing in modern Western public life to put by its side of the statement, unless it were, for all the difference in its source, the words of the American Thoreau in his classical treatise on the duty of civil disobedience." End quote. Drawing from Gandhi's pronouncements, Buber poses the question if the solitary man can be politically effective without masses drawn to his charisma, following him in whatever he does. Correctly summarizing Gandhi's position and offering a tentative answer, Buber suggests that Gandhi fears the majority if the majority follows him without going through an inner transformation. Referring to Gandhi's desire to introduce religion in politics, Buber recalls Gandhi describing politics as the coil of a serpent that strangles one and out of whose coil one cannot slip out even if one tries. Gandhi wanted to wrestle with the serpent. This impels Buber to reframe the question. Does religion allow itself to be introduced into politics in such a way that a political success can be obtained? Carefully unraveling the complexity of the question of religion and politics, Buber proposes the following formulations. Number one, religion implies the goal and the way. Number two, politics implies the end and the means. Number three, political goals are marked by success and their attainment can be historically recorded. Number four, religious goals just indicate a way but never enter into historical consummation. Number five, sometimes the religious goal and its attainment are referred to in terms of the word being victorious, but that is not religion in its purest, but religion in its corrupt form. These formulations lead Buber into yet again recasting the question. Is political success to be attained through religious deed? Admitting that Gandhi is religious in the most genuine sense, Buber wonders if his experiments in introducing religion into politics could lead to a blind following of the word. For example, Buber tells his readers, by Gandhi's own admission, the Indian fidelity to non-violence was skin deep. Gandhi had called it a non-violence born out of helplessness, the compulsory non-violence of the weak. Buber calls this Gandhi's paradoxical position. As long as Gandhi is in politics, even if he does not consciously introduce religion into politics, he still allies his religion with the politics of others. Put differently, he cannot endlessly wrestle with the serpent. There are times when he has to get along with the serpent because he is directed to work with the serpent in the kingdom of the serpent. He refuses to exploit human passions, Buber writes, but he is chained as a political actor to the political, to untransformed men. In other words, the serpent is powerful outside, but also within the hearts of those who long for political success. He admires Gandhi's self-criticism, self-mortification, and self-purification in the face of the serpent getting overwhelming, but emphatically refuses to follow him in the mixing of religion and politics. While rejecting the suggestion that there was some inner contradiction in Gandhi, Buber sharply delineates the contradiction between what he calls the unconditionality of a spirit and the conditionality of a situation. This is exactly where the masses of people following Gandhi belonged, to the conditionality of the situation. Returning to Gandhi's words, Buber cites Gandhi saying that if Indian people showed discipline, self-denial, readiness to sacrifice, capacity for order, confidence and courage, then Swaraj, or home rule, could be attained within a year. If India wants to become free, it can do so with God's help. God helps the truthful and the non-violent, Gandhi had said. Buber strenuously objects to this formulation. This is religious, he says, for it calls for an inner transformation. God's love is not measured by success. One may be certain of the truthfulness and non-violence of the love of God, but not the attainment of Swaraj in 1 year. The phrase, in 1 year, says Buber, is a political word, whereas in religion there is no stipulation of time. Hence, victory comes at times, if at all, just when one no longer expects it. Swaraj so attained would then imply only a transformation of institutions and not a simultaneous transformation of men. Warning Gandhi that introducing religion into politics would run the danger of mingling of categories, Buber argues that this would ultimately result in the evaporation of religion in the rapid fire of political activity. The goal will become an end, the way a means, and that man, instead of treading in the path taken by that step of God through history, will run blindly over it. The above discussion seems to suggest that nonviolence belongs correctly in the realm of faith and is forever condemned to remain impervious to the conditionality of a situation. Moreover, the possibility of nonviolence seems, at the best of times, hostage to the efficacy of nonviolence. Gandhi's own experiments with nonviolence are beset with enormous puzzles and some obvious contradictions. As a unique exemplar of nonviolence, Gandhi's limitations are often read back into any formulation of the possibility of nonviolence, and often enough rejected for this very reason. In other words, many arguments questioning the efficacy or the possibility of nonviolence seem to relegate nonviolence and people who practice it to the margins of history. Arthur Koestler's Yogi and the Commissar. Paul Ricoeur disagrees. In an essay titled The Historical Presence of Nonviolence, which was published in Cross Currents in the winter of 1964, Ricoeur begins by stating that the Sermon on the Mount, with its nonviolence, has a great deal to do with our history and the whole of history, including politics and social structures. It cannot be confined to private acts without historical significance. It enters history making an extremely difficult demand. It demands explanation for what we will have done to others, for only that will determine the complete meaning of what we shall have willed, the way we have acted, and the reasons that impelled those actions. Not every human being is tolerable to every other. Ricker argues. Certain people represent an excess to others. The main aim of violence then is the death of the other, at least death or something worse than death. What is in excess is not often just life. It is the sanctity of the body, human dignity, human values, and human joy. Violence aims to finish off this excess. It is this terror that makes and shapes history. But if history is violence, non-violence is history's bad conscience. Non-violence causes uneasiness regarding living in this history, and conscience stands in opposition to current history in the guise of ethics. History says violence. Conscience rises up to say love. The act of an individual practicing non-violence then has a double meaning. It furthers the aim of the values he espouses and compels history to recognize the other, not as excess, but in the form of an altered way of looking at other humans. Hence, there is no way in a verifiable sense of measuring a non-violent individual's efficacy. It is at a level at which the bond between action and history is the object of faith. The non-violent man can thus be untimely or unreasonable. Gandhi, Ricker says, was one such man. He had his limitations. His distrust of modern, Ricker lists his limitations. His distrust of modern technique, his lack of comprehension for the organized proletariat, his ultimate respect for those traditional structures responsible for the alienation of the Indian masses, especially those that profited the priests and the rich. Recognizing these limitations, Ricker sees Gandhi's nonviolence firstly as a piece within a total spiritual system, along with truth, poverty, justice, chastity, patience, boldness, scorn of death, and recollection. On the other hand, non-violence was for Gandhi a method and even a detailed technique for resistance and disobedience. Gandhi's actions show the unmistakably active character of non-violence. In Gandhi's view, the real laissez-faire is violence, whereby it facilitates me to deliver myself up to the leader, to the chief, to authority, to insolent might. It is non-violence that embodies strength. In precisely this sense that it is different from progressivist violence, which Ricker calls the art of using roundabout means, the detours of trickery, lying, and violence. These constitute the technique of patriotism and of revolution. It is precisely here that the practitioner of non-violence answers to the question of the effectiveness of non-violence by asking, does not following these detours involve the peril of perpetuating an endless violence? All political action, Ricker suggests, whether patriotic or revolutionary, where the goals are the means, requires a reproachful presence, but also requires appeals to friendship, symbolic gestures, and a very important phrase here, partially successful actions. Can nonviolence still afford, then, to ignore peculiar circumstances, as Buber calls them? Instances where its invocation is met only with anonymous martyrdom. The soul of nonviolence, Ricker emphasizes, lies in its intolerance of any mixture or compromise, if you wish to call it that. If faith in nonviolence is not total, it denies itself. If nonviolence is the vocation of a few, concludes Ricker, it must appear to them in the sense practitioners of nonviolence, as the duty of all. To live non-violence as a participant and not as a bystander or a spectator is to concede that non-violence audaciously aims to be the whole of action. It embodies and manifests the will that aims to construct history. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyotirmaya, for this fascinating insight into a little-known correspondence, but also into a meditation on not only the question of violence, but also the relationship between religion and politics, much more generally. Let me open, without further ado, to discussions, comments, questions from the floor, and ask for show of hands. Anybody who would like to begin?
It's not regarding your thesis as in general, but one question I have since a long time: the Satyagraha. Is there one concept in English for it?
I didn't get you. Is there one?
One translation in English for the word Satyagraha?
No. There are approximate meanings, and Gandhi scholars are torn between this or that meaning. But soul force or truth force is what Gandhi, in the last, he wrote this book called The Hindu Swaraj, as I mentioned to you, in 1909. And it went through several editions. And each edition in his own lifetime he corrected. He removed a word here, added a word there, and so on and so forth.
You mean he wrote it in English?
He wrote it first in Gujarati, his mother tongue. And then it was translated into English, which he approved. He approved of the English translation. The English translation came much later, very, very much later. And but he approved of every line, every word, every sentence, took a word out here, took a word out there. So he preferred to flip-flop between soul force or truth force for Satyagraha.
I think I somewhere read that he also mentioned its insistence on truth.
Yes, I mean, as I said in my talk, I should have shown that. Since you asked the question, I should have shown that. I have an Excel sheet of the variations in certain key concepts and Gandhi's definition of those. I mean, you know, he lived. He wasn't an academic. He was a thinker, activist, politician, all sorts of things. And so sometimes people have to address their audience and tailor what they say in a certain sense to audience. But I don't think he wavered from what he said in Hindu Swaraj. Because in the late 30s, he has a quarrel with Nehru regarding something that's there in the Hindu Swaraj. And it's a fascinating exchange of letters, at the end of which Nehru says to Gandhi, "Oh, you are far greater than your little books." It's a very famous sentence. You are far greater than your little books. Where Gandhi says, "No, this is my seed text. I will not waver from it. I will not deviate from it."
Thank you. Maybe I'm opening a whole can of worms with this question, but I'll just throw it out at you provocatively. From what you said tonight, the portrait of Gandhi that emerges, at least for very superficial student of Indian history, such as myself, is that he was peculiarly given to, well, to paraphrase Benedict Anderson, not to spectres of comparison, but to chimeras of comparison. That is, seeing analogies and maybe even false analogies across space and time, of stepping outside history, conflating things that are separated not only in geopolitical space but also in time. So I wonder if you can tell us something about the first theme that you consciously try to avoid in your talk. The Arab-Israeli question and the mandate of Palestine. First, did Buber in this letter reflect on this in any way? And second, do you have signs of this chimeric thinking that Gandhi seems to have succumbed to in whatever Gandhi had to say about this first theme?
The first thing would actually require an entire separate talk, because it's interconnected with the question of Muslims in India, the Khilafat movement as it was called, which was the re-establishment of the rule of Turkey over what was at that point of time a large part of the Arab world, the Ottoman Empire. There's that. It's a huge question, and he wants the Caliph to be re-established post 1921-22. Everybody's aghast. Why is he playing into the hands of the religious clergy and so on and so forth? The flip-flops are fascinating. The chimera that you are alluding to is fascinating. For one simple reason, that in my talk I quoted Gandhi saying that the idea of a Jewish Palestine is not a geographical entity. It's only in the hearts of the Jews. 5 years ago, he says, and I quote from the collected works of Gandhi, "Similarly, the Muslims cannot abandon a claim based on the Quranic injunctions because a weak and helpless Turkey cannot sustain it. Palestine belongs to the Arabs." Yeah. In the piece that I paraphrased for you, because it's a long piece of Gandhi, the Jews, when he discusses the Arab-Jewish question, Gandhi actually says that because the Arabs by war occupied this land, by conventional wisdom, they are entitled to it. Now, it's there. I mean, I can read it out to you, but it's part of juggling far too many things. And as I said, the expectation of the kind of consistency that we expect in academic works from a man who lived a long life of enormous pressure, addressing all kinds of audiences, I wouldn't expect him to do that. My expectations of Gandhi are slightly more modest. The criticism as far as his preoccupation with the Arabs is concerned, and his indifference to the Jews, the Jewish question. Let me read excerpts to you from, in all of Gandhi, in terms of the tone, the vehemence of the tone, in terms of the stridency of the tone, I haven't come across another letter or communication which is so strident. And that's a friend of his from the South Africa days, Henry Pollock, who writes to him in November 1939, November 23rd, 1939, a letter. And he says, If you had a drop of Jewish blood in you, you could not have rested until, without hatred and without a desire for vengeance, but from the deepest and holiest sense of duty. And then he cites an instance of an Indian epic where Sri Krishna, God-like individual, spoke to Arjuna, a warrior who doesn't want to fight. You had done your uttermost to destroy. Pollock's term for the Nazi regime is a locust regime that's seeking to devour every beautiful thing that mankind, intuitively realizing its godly nature, has been developing during the ages of the development. Why? Nobody dared say to Gandhi in 1939, why is he taking the position? Pollock says, because you are echoing Jawaharlal Nehru's endless repetition of the nonsensical mantra of British imperialism. His pet bogey of his quote, not mine, of British imperialism. Or even more harshly, Jawaharlal has always misled you by his ineradicable passion for leftist ideological phraseology and his blindness to facts. Now, you may debate whether that's true, that's not true, and that's, to use Gandhi's own term, not my mandate or province. But let me just give you an example, a small example. 1942, Gandhi says this: the Allies have no right to call their cause to be morally superior to the Nazis, so long as they hold in custody the fairest part and one of the most ancient nations of the earth. Pollock refers to this in another letter he writes several years later and says, narrow nationalism has defeated you, bhai. I have not known anybody else, among his friends at least, call him bhai, which is brother. They all would call him Bapu or Mahatma. The great poet Tagore would call him that. Pollock is aghast. And he says, let me quote Pollock one more paragraph. He says, in India, it seems so much easier to refrain, to stand aloof, to non-cooperate, than to join together to get things done, to gain experience, to create and construct and educate, and provide opportunities for greater effort and the conquest of disease, poverty, and ignorance. I know, of course, all the arguments for non-cooperation. I know, too, how they have been falsified in practice by your repeated admissions. I know all the arguments for positive nonviolence. I know, too, how you yourself have been repeatedly deceived by those who have vowed themselves to it and betrayed you both and the ideal that they have sworn to defend. I know how hatred has spread throughout the country until its face has been unrecognizably distorted. Whose hatred was it that did this? That of the British imperialists or the Indian nationalists? I mean, this is Pollock saying in 1939. So, now, as far as the contradictions are concerned, Gandhi professed to have no interest in history. And if you honestly read the 98 volumes, and I don't wish that even on my enemies, I mean, in terms of just the volume, not the content, you wouldn't find a cogent, coherent, single page of historical analysis. History would be used. He would use historical terms and historical figures and so on and so forth, but in a kind of way which had no consistency. His position regarding history is very straight. All history is the history of kings, queens, violence, and hence violence and wars. But in a more sophisticated sense, he says, what is memory? Memory is the history of attachment. I know something, and so I have a memory of it. When I recall something, what do I recall? I recall all the things that I should not recall. settle scores with you. Yesterday you said something nasty to me. I remember it. Now today I'll settle scores. And he therefore says, history therefore is nothing but a memory of the past, just as individuals get trapped by the memory of the past and become boastful, vengeful, and resentful. Nations too have a historical memory, but it's mediated through various versions of that memory. People quarrel about the authenticity of their account of history as contrasted with someone else's version of history. It is a spiral that never ends, and if it does, it results in bloodshed and violence. That's his position. So, yeah. Have I remotely answered you? Stephen, I think.
This was, Jyoti, this was such a rich and interesting and fascinating lecture. And to some extent, I am confused because, not because you were confusing, but just because there was so many voices. There were 4 voices at least here. There was you, there was Gandhi, there was Buber, there was Ricoeur, and there was
and
you,
me.
and there was you.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out. Well, what I'd like to know, I think, is this: there's one level of questions which, to some extent, you were addressing, which has to do with nonviolence as a strategy, as a practice, and the question of its effectiveness or not, and under what conditions. There's that question, which you certainly have been talking about, at least in respect of all these 4 interlocutors.
Yeah.
But there's another level which it seems to me you are also talking about, which I'd like to hear about, which is this question of categories, of religion on the one hand and politics on the other. And you said various things about that in respect of all the 4 voices. I actually want to know what Jyoti thinks about this, but also whether Buber and Gandhi were in dispute. The question being, what is the relation between religion and politics? At one point, you were saying, I noticed, religion isn't concerned with time. There's no time in religion. It's kind of time.
Buber says that.
Yeah, well, okay, Buber said, but so, all right. But but that's one way of thinking about how religion and politics are different categories. Was it, I mean, for example, here's to ask the question in a very simplistic way, maybe. Were Buber and Gandhi differing about the question of whether religion and politics were to be separated or infused in one, I mean, not separated? Was that partly the issue?
Thank you, Stephen, for this rich mixture of comments and questions. Regarding what does Jyoti think about religion and politics, I think I have already written 3 volumes to say that religion and politics is a bad idea. So I do think it's a bad idea in any other form. But there is a question, and I think you see the voices. I mean, let's confine ourselves to 3 voices at the moment. There's Gandhi, who says nonviolence is something which is religious. And I'll come to it in a moment. For him, it is religious. I used to think it is not, but I have, in a certain sense, nuanced my position regarding that. It comes from a religious core, as far as Gandhi is concerned. Where does that religious core belong? Over the years, 30 years, one has been told it comes from this Indian tradition, that Indian tradition, X Indian tradition, Y Indian tradition. I probably have a tentative suggestion to a new, since you are writing a new book, you ought to have a new suggestion. So I'm going to add to the explanations one more explanation when the book is out. So my position is clear, but let's look at Gandhi. What is Gandhi saying? He's saying, without non-violence, which for him is reducible, if I were to dramatize the whole discourse, to willingly suffering and dying. I mean, that death bit is absolutely crucial to my mind in this whole bit. And let me supplement this with, to my mind, the most sophisticated explanation for why death was so important to Gandhi vis-a-vis non-violence, and was it religious or not. In my current understanding, I have not found anything comparable to something he wrote in another newspaper he used to publish, which is Young India, of 22nd November 1928. This is how the explanation goes. You will bear with me. He says, the virtue of a religious ideal is that it cannot be completely realized in the flesh. Where would there be scope for its infinite expansion, which is its essential characteristic? Where would be room for that constant striving, that ceaseless quest after the ideal that is the basis of all spiritual progress? If mortals could reach the perfect state while the body is still there. And he says, it is a state in which the will to live is completely overcome by ever-active desire to realize the ideal of ahimsa, and all attachment to body ceasing, man is freed from the further necessity of possessing an earthly cloth. And finally, he says, but so long as that consummation is not reached, a man must go on paying the toll of himsa, that's violence, for himsa is inseparable from all physical existence, and it will have its due. So, to have the body itself, he's saying, if that body is to be relegated to a religious ideal, which means it expands, it flowers, it blossoms into an infinity and a plenitude that the religious ideal seeks, then it cannot be had with this body, because this body is the vehicle of all violence. Now, there are people who have said to me, but is that not a modern understanding of violence? Of course it is, in a certain sense. My tentative argument is that if you see Hindu Swaraj, his seed text, the first, and in Gandhi's own hands, the first recommended reading is Sermon on the Mount. He writes it with his own hand. That's the first piece of recommended reading as far as Gandhi is concerned. And he is fascinated by martyrdom, religious martyrdom. So let me answer your question in a roundabout way. There were these revolutionary terrorists. I won't confuse by giving more names and dates. Let's say there were these revolutionary terrorists who did not subscribe to Gandhi's methods of attaining India's independence. One of them in 1919, one of them much later, Udham Singh in 1919, 1929, Bhagat Singh and his co-conspirators. All of them killed a British officer. Dwyer in the case of Udham Singh, and Saunders in the case of, Saunders in the case of Bhagat Singh, Dwyer in the case of Udham Singh. All of them were to be hanged. Gandhi emphatically refuses to say that they are martyrs. He says one set of them are wedded to violence, but also are atheists. There's a fascinating new book on this whole question by a young academic called Niti Nair, explores this entire business of religious martyrdom. He says they're not martyrs. He says, I want them to live, but I don't think that people should emulate them in any sense of the term. So it's a complicated position. He wants, the ideal for nonviolence in Gandhi is a religious ideal. But Buber wants to separate it. Yeah, Buber wants to separate it. Buber says, no, that there are moments when expediency comes in, and also sometimes you have to make a judgment. I think what's important in Buber is this idea that one has to make a judgment. Because you could turn around and ask a silly question, but how does Buber know this is good? You can always ask such questions. How does he arrive at the conception of the good? No. When your children are dying, when your community is being erased, you have a fairly decent sense of the good. But, my third voice, I like. I like the Ricker voice for simply one reason. It doesn't say that nobody is condoning what Gandhi said about Jews in Germany. That is, it was insensitive, perhaps even impractical, perhaps crazy, completely cuckoo. Buber's criticisms are all well taken, fantastically well taken. But I'm not interested in either Gandhi or Buber as Gandhi and Buber. I'm interested in nonviolence and violence. And hence the question whether nonviolence can only be confined to its efficacy in specific contexts. Or, as Ricker says, in politics, whether patriotic or revolutionary, where goals are the means, it requires a reproachful presence, but also appeals to friendship, symbolic gestures, and, most crucially, partially successful actions. I think that, to my mind, in a certain sense, is my enterprise. So in a certain sense, I have also answered the question about the fourth voice. Thank you, Stephen.
Since I occupy the micro, so my simple question would be, as you mentioned in the very beginning, that Buber never, that Gandhi never replied to this letter.
Yeah.
So, do you know why it is? So, was it a kind of ignorance, or was it very obvious what he would have replied, or is there any indication in his writings whether there was any influence of that letter?
Thank you. Fascinating question, because Gandhi replied to every letter he got. I mean, if there was a case of one person conscientiously, I mean, you could be a stranger on the street and write to him, you would get a line, at least a line. There was a time when he was growing old and infirm, and his right hand would pain. So he got a steno to take dictation for the letters, and dismissed him in 3 or 4 days and said it's too impersonal, and then taught his left hand also to write. So when the right hand got tired, he would write with it. And his handwriting was appalling. I don't know of any instance of this kind. I mean, this power, this pathos, this persuasiveness that Gandhi had got and not replied. So I don't know the answer. Now, the second part of your question, he alludes to this without naming Buber. You see, I have the CD-ROM, and we are colleagues, and give you the CD-ROM. You put collected works of Gandhi and search for Buber. Not one reference. The president of the Hebrew University, Jerusalem, at that point of time, who posted his own protest letter to Gandhi along with Buber's, which is also there in the archives in Delhi, from where this has come, he got a reply. But Buber doesn't get a reply. Chaim Gordon receives a reply, but Buber doesn't. I think the truth, the sheer force of the criticism, Gandhi, it would have bit to the bone. It would have affected Gandhi profoundly. And very soon after this letter arrives Pollock's letter. I mean, I've not even read to you 1/4 of Pollock's letter. It is devastating in its criticism. And nobody who knows Gandhi could ever challenge the love that Pollock had for Gandhi. But that criticism, that vehement criticism, is born out of that sense of belonging to a universe that Gandhi inhabited, and that universe getting vitiated by, as Pollock thinks, by bad advice or bad policies or listening to somebody else and so on and so forth. So he obliquely refers to the themes in Buber's letter, but never directly. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. No Gandhian of that period, of that era is alive for one to go and ask, why didn't he reply to Buber's letter? You look at standard biographies of Gandhi. Standard biographies of Gandhi. I consider Catherine Tidricks's biography to be one of the finer ones. There is not one reference to Buber's letter. Not one. There's an entire section on Khilafat, on the whole question of Turkey and the Arab world and so on, and the Arabs in Palestine and so on and so forth. Not one reference to the great. There's this fantastic colleague in the University of Minnesota who has worked on Gandhi for 15 years, Ajay Skaria, and produced a fantastic book on Gandhi. I just turned to the index the other day to look. Not one reference to Buber. Not one. What have we missed, and why have we missed it? I don't know.
Jyoti, Pavel wants to ask a question. I think I should also. I have a follow-up question, however, on this. And that is, I was just thinking to myself, what a pity we didn't come up with this question earlier, because Madhav Bhai would have maybe been able to answer it. And
No, his son.
And Narayan Bhai.
I met Narayan Bhai about 5 years ago, but I wasn't working on this.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, so Madhav Bhai passed away early, but Narayan Bhai was alive until a few years ago.
I went to Sudat to meet him.
But he couldn't, he didn't.
No, I didn't have the question.
Didn't have the question.
I didn't have the question. I wasn't working on Buber at that point of time.
Because I mean, Narayan Bhai was young, of course, then, but he would still have had an answer. And as you know,
I did a feature on him for the Hindu for the 100th anniversary of the Dandi March. Spent a whole day with him.
Yeah, and he, of course. So he may have. I'm not sure. He was young then, but he may have had an answer.
He must have some insight.
But there may have been a conversation around it at least. And now I'm going to ask you something which actually I should know, because as you know, my mother was one of the translators of the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. Yeah. But unlike you, I did not read the volumes as they were coming out. So my question is to follow up on the one that Gabor just asked you. So yes, he doesn't reply to Buber. But does he obviously replies to Chaim Gordon, but he also replies to Pollock, presumably. No. He also doesn't reply.
No, he replies to Pollock in terms of acknowledgement.
But no reply.
No detailed reply. You see, in Pollock's case, what is strange also, I'm so glad you asked this. In Pollock's case, the collected works has consigned Pollock's letter as part of a tiny index at the back of volume. I stand to correction here, I'm doing it from memory, 68, I think, volume 68. It's in fine print. It's not the normal print of the collected works. It's really terrible small print. And so he writes to Pollock, my dear Pollock, got your letter. I'm paraphrasing. I understand your agony and your anger. Longer letter soon to follow. But what I quoted at one point of time, where Gandhi says, if there was, there are people who say, if there was a Jewish Gandhi, he would be eliminated in 5 minutes. He would be sent to the guillotine. That's Heimgarten's letter. That he doesn't, again, name Heimgarten, but he says somebody has suggested this, and this is what they say, but I'm not convinced.
But so then the question would be, so this is what I was saying, so this is not a one-shot story. He's not replying to anybody, any one of them on this entire question.
Yeah.
And
But the silence in this case is thunderous.
no, it's stunning.
Yeah.
But the others so there is a pattern to it.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
No,
it's
absolutely.
not just
Absolutely.
So, so that my follow-up question on this is: so having received these letters, and then also the reproach, or more than a reproach, saying you have been misled on the facts
By Nehru. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He, after 45, he never even returns to the question.
No, I quoted you 46 that he blames the
Yes,
Jews for not
but-
following
Yeah.
the path of peace.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But is that the only thing he does? He's not, it's not like, even if he doesn't name them, it's not as if he, now he has facts, which he probably, we don't know if Nehru misled him or who misled him, or what,
Exactly.
what were the sources of what
Yeah.
he was reading at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
But by 45, he should have had all the facts at his disposal, and he has all of these letters.
I think.
And yet he never comes back.
No,
to
the
this.
curious, I'm so glad you asked this, and it goes to the heart of the matter. Gandhi never directly refers to this, doesn't come back to the substantive issues raised in the letter, or by many other Jewish friends and followers of his. After all, a lot of his friends from South Africa who were in London at that point of time were all Jewish. Kallenbach. All of them were Jewish. He lost a lot of friends during this period. Pollock says that in his letter. Pollock says, are you not ashamed at your age to lose friends? Here is the Pollock letter. I think I have it. I mean, here is the Pollock letter. Huge, huge letter. Step by step. He's saying people in London are aghast. I mean, this bogey of British imperialism, British imperialism. If you read the last sentence of this letter, Pollock's letter, he says, I mean, everything is relegated to British imperialism. Every explanation is British imperialism. We are fighting British imperialism. How the hell do you account for any causal connection to the real world? You know, what is interesting is, I was constrained a little because there were not many English versions of Buber's works available in Vienna. They're all in German. And so I bought a few, including the letters, the collected letters of Buber. Once Buber writes this, and he doesn't get a reply, he switches off Gandhi. Buber lived till about 1966, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 65 or 66. 67. 67. There is no reference to the voice that gave counsel, that gave comfort, the voice that I hear most and above all other voices. Buber switches off Gandhi. So it's not that Gandhi himself, to go back to Shalini and Gabor's question, they both switch off each other. And there are compelling reasons. I mean, Pollock's letter, I first read Pollock's letter some 3 years ago, and I said to myself, there were very few people. Gandhi had attained this larger-than-life aura and, sense of reverence that people gave him. And there were very few people who could speak to him in this tone. I mean, there's affection. There is affection. He's protective of Gandhi almost, that you're committing this error. But it is also showing, I mean, Pollock's passages of the corruption in decision-making in the Congress, if you change the name, a few names here and there, and print them in tomorrow morning's Times of India, could read for the Congress of today. And this is 1939 we are talking about.
So I just wanted to make 2 comments. When you started, Jyoti, I thought that this will be a story about a misplaced comparison, that it will be a story about Gandhi not fully grasping the situation of the European Jewry and basically mistaking the Nazi regime for the imperial but still liberal imperialism of the British Raj in India. Then when you continued, when you actually started with Buber's letter, I thought it will be a story about politics and religion and the relation between politics and religion. And that Buber's argument is basically that there are certain situations which call for direct political action, and religion is simply helpless and even immoral in a way. But then, during the Q&A, when you quoted Gandhi's, I don't remember if it was from a letter or from an article from 1942, in which he states that there is something utterly wrong about giving certain moral power to the Allies because they're equally immoral as the Nazis because they are still keeping India enslaved. And plus, there were also some earlier fragments from the 30s which were actually admired by Buber, in which he says that, well, I still think that, Indian independence is the most important goal of all. So when you came to this fragment, and I also remembered that I actually saw an original of the letter that Gandhi wrote to Hitler in 1938 in Mumbai. So then I thought maybe it is a story of religious, of politics, of a certain political message or even a political strategy masquerading as religious ethics. Because maybe, all in all, it is about Gandhi trying to basically force Brits to basically promise independence to India in exchange for a certain more decisive stand against the Axis. So maybe this talk about non-violence in this context is in fact a certain political strategy rather than ethics. This is the first comment, and I would be really interested in hearing your thoughts about this. And the second point is about martyrdom, because it's not only that Buber is criticizing martyrdom or a certain vision of martyrdom of the European Jewry that Gandhi proposes in his article. He's, as far as I remember, and this I assume was a direct quote from Buber, he speaks about silent martyrdom. And
Anonymous.
Or anonymous and silent martyrdom.
Yeah.
And there is a big difference, because in the Jewish tradition, there is a certain, in the political tradition also, political philosophy, Jewish political philosophy that was conceived shortly after the war in response to Holocaust. Think of Emil Fackenheim, for example. There is a certain call for remembering. So even the most pure ethical religious sacrifice is pointless if the memory of the scripture, if the memory of the religious tradition is lost. There are letters, for example, there are sermons of rabbis from the Warsaw Ghetto who are asked very practical questions. I mean, if I'm offered to give my child away to the Gentiles, and the child will be saved, should I do it or should I keep my child in the ghetto? No, you should not give your child away because he or she will be lost for the Jewish tradition, for the Jewish faith. So, you know, there is silent martyrdom or anonymous martyrdom is not the same as martyrdom as such. So the distinction between martyrs who are not in fact martyrs like Bhagat Singh because they committed violent crimes, as you know, political as they may have been, is one thing. But another important distinction, I think, is the distinction between the silent anonymous martyrdom and martyrdom as such. Because if the martyrdom is silent, it's simply pointless from the point of view of Buber, I think.
Absolutely. Let me.
Mine is also a follow-up.
Yeah,
Mine,
sure.
Yeah, mine is also a follow-up. Really, Pavel took the words out of my mouth. I really think that, I mean, it seems in your presentation that you seem that Buber got it right, and in somehow we understood Gandhi even better than Gandhi, turning him against himself. But perhaps Buber was wrong, and I would like to suggest a possible reading of it, and Gandhi was right in many ways. Because if we look at the problem of not how to bridge between a universal religion and some sort of national particularism, which is the Jewish problem, but not as much the Hindu problem, then we look at Palestine and Germany in 1939 as two different separate cases. One in which, first of all, in 1939, it's way before concentration camps, Jews are merely less than 1% in Germany, and first of all, what can they really do? Now, secondly, if you're in Gandhi's position, you would think about them as a minority. And if Gandhi is truly thinking about India, thinking about Jews in post-1935 Nuremberg legislation as a sort of lower caste, as the Indian case would have it, and wouldn't maybe calling them to rise to arms pose problems within the caste system within India? That is one thing. And secondly, if we look at the Muslim question in India, at the time, so in the British Raj, then it's basically Palestine is a perfect example of showing, no, I have no problems with Muslims, it's just an issue of the majority. And therefore, even in 1946, where you read, by the way, it's not a question of the Holocaust, he's, your quote, he's condemning sort of Jewish national terrorism, and the Jews in 46 are still the minority in Palestine. So perhaps for him, it's once again, I'm against the minority, let the majority rule, more of like a Westphalian notion. And in that case, he's very consistent. I don't want the minorities in Germany to rise to arms because of the caste, and maybe in Palestine because, well, Pakistan is sort of the solution.
No, that's much later. Can I answer these two because I'll get derailed? Okay.
So I would just like to reiterate Pavel's question, going back to the extent of one sentence to the relationship between politics and religion. Would you say that Gandhi was a very smart man, a tricky man? I would say that by insisting that nonviolence is a religious idea, he basically tricked Indians into collective political action?
Thank you. These are fascinating and very difficult questions, so let me answer them one by one. The suggestion that there was nothing religious about nonviolence, that this was part of a larger political charade, I don't know. I mean, the more I read Gandhi, the less I understand him. And to an extent, the less I like him. But having said that, likes or dislikes apart, in my part of the world, there's a saying that he is like an earthen terracotta pot with so many holes that if you plug one, the water would still seep out of the other. It's just endless. Let's look at concrete examples. There is a man called Swami Shraddhanand. Gandhi comes back to India in 1915. Shraddhanand by that time has become a religious leader of the Arya Samaj, which is a Hindu revivalist organization, wanting to go back to the word of the Vedas. Shraddhanand wants religion in politics. Gandhi promises him that. But there's not enough religion in politics, so Shraddhanand gets disillusioned. He begins as a great champion of Hindu-Muslim unity, but gets disillusioned after that and becomes a completely crazy, or not even crazy, crazed Muslim hater. And then he's assassinated by a young Muslim boy in 1926. And Gandhi writes 3 pieces after this. There is nothing in Shraddhanand if it was simply political calculation, or in the act of this Muslim boy, for Gandhi to rhapsodize about Shraddhanand. The three obituaries that appear, one after the other. One appears as soon as the assassination happens, then one in December, then one in January 19. I have a published paper on this, just chronicling the contradictions. What makes Gandhi rhapsodize about a patently distasteful man like Shraddhanand, who would be no assistance to Gandhi in his political life? Shraddhanand was a spent force. By the time, I forget the name of the German author who wrote this book called The History of the Assassins. Does anyone know here? History of the Assassins, which is against the Arabs and the Muslims. It was published in the early years of the 20th century. And when Shraddhanand was assassinated, he was basically translating that book for wider dissemination to warn the Hindus about how evil the Muslims were. Now, Shraddhanand, by the time he is assassinated, he is a very distasteful man. Gandhi calls him a martyr and rhapsodizes about death exactly in the same way that he does when he tells the German Jews, follow death. Indulge in nonviolent resistance. Now the question is, why is Bhagat Singh, even with his insistence on violent ways of, after all, there's a whole history of Bhagat Singh performing nonviolent resistance against the British in prison. That Jatin Das, another of his fellow conspirator, starves himself to death in a British prison after 63 days, dies. And Gandhi says they are not martyrs. But a very distasteful man like Shraddhanand is a martyr. And the catchphrase, where you get this preoccupation with religion with Gandhi is this. He says, regarding Shraddhanand, somebody writes to him and says, are you sure you want to call Shraddhanand a martyr? This is after the second piece appears in December. And Gandhi says, yes. Because this young Muslim boy who went ostensibly to interview Shraddhanand was interviewing him about these salient features of Hinduism. And Shraddhanand was talking to him about religion. And while speaking about religion, he was murdered. And falsely so. And hence he's a martyr. So I'm not sure. I'm not really sure if everything is he was a very shrewd politician. He was a consummate politician. There's no doubt about it. But in the book, I have these 7 instances of actual violence. I mean, I'm not taking into account structural violence, poverty, etc., which, by the way, Paul Ricoeur tells us to take into account when one discusses violence. I'm not even taking that into account. I mean, there is a riot. To my mind, it's the prototype of every riot that's happened in India, the Hindu-Muslim riot, 1926-27 in Kohat, which is now in Northwest Frontier Province. Gandhi is asked to go as part of a delegation to collect evidence as to what happened there. And the collected works of Gandhi have the entire transcript of the deposition of various parties involved. And you have to be either stupid or moronic or an imbecile to not catch that Gandhi has a bias. It's there in the collected works. And yet, there are instances where, nonviolence is seen as... So, whether it's trickery or it's not trickery, at least he kept, even if it was trickery, let's suppose it was trickery, the trickery kept a lid on violence without changing social structures or inequalities or inequities or questioning Hinduism and the inherent violence within a particular religion, which is Hinduism, probably minimized it. But was it deliberate trickery? I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I'm not saying this rhetorically, I don't know. Because the moment I say, yes, it is trickery in some instance, I'll give you another instance. 1923, Gandhi says, I am going to use, your question, I am going to use, Anir, I am going to use my support for the question of the Caliph in Turkey, the Caliphate in Turkey, to further enhance Hindu-Muslim unity in India. And the word he uses, I am going to barter. 1938, there is an angry letter by Gandhi saying, if you think I am supporting Arabs in Palestine because I want a reciprocal benefit for the position of Hindu-Muslim unity, then you have misunderstood me, you are wrong, and how dare you suggest that? How do you square that circle? I often tell my students sometimes that the only way to read Indian thought that I've discovered for myself is to chronicle the contradictions. If you try to tie these knots up, God help you. Yes.
Actually, we have wondered from the question. It's very much related to follow-up, actually, what Luke was asking you about that, the religion and politics. I mean, this is, I think that it is the what I find it fascinating, but you have to take my question from a kind of a mortal who doesn't know much about Gandhi in terms of details and then the Indian history. But in terms of the efficacy of nonviolence, and then that it's you depicted very clearly, I think that it is about the efficacy is that nonviolence was about faith and truthful position, and it's not about political principle. It is not about that. So that it is, in a way, that the politics could not be, the organizing principle and then, or the core could not be anything outside of, or without the religion, it could not function. Okay, that is the Gandhi's position. But then, I don't know much about India and Gandhi, but I do Gandhi and India, but I do care about in terms of sites and different sites and forms of resistance. And then you were talking about saying that in relation to Gandhi, partially successful actions. This is the resistance, and this is for that partially successful actions, and which are, and then these are the resistance in religion in its pure form. then what is then, because the efficacy question I do understand in relation to the religion, but successful, partially successful actions, successful in a way that assumes a kind of a vision of a vision of a society, other. I mean, if you take if it's not only religion in its pure form, then what could that be? What do we draw from this kind of a position? It's like pushing your voice in that. What do I take from this in relation to resistance, in the different kind of a form of a resistance, which is about partial successful of actions, which creates a kind of cracks in the system where the light gets in, that which you could not, maybe this might be the successful, but it assumes a particular vision of a society which might not be, could not be answered completely through that religion. And there I would like to hear your voice.
Yeah, thank you so much for these wonderful questions. First, the question of efficacy and whether it's the organizing principle in it is religion. My exploration, I don't have an answer. So my exploration, that's why Ricker comes in to help me out, is simply the question whether nonviolence can be brought center stage. Whether nonviolence can become not the preoccupation of the marginal, as it always is, inevitably is, or can nonviolence have some way in which it can become part of the mainstream political discourse. And that's in a certain sense my preoccupation. For Buber, nonviolence, he doesn't dismiss nonviolence, but it doesn't come from the religious side of it. It can exist. Buber doesn't say nonviolence can't exist. It can exist over a period of time, not bothering for results of any kind, but quietly, patiently trying to transform human beings. That's Buber's position vis-a-vis nonviolence. He's not bothered whether at that juncture, whether it's religious or political. In a way, that's also answering Stevens's question. Because the question there is of way and mean and goal and way. So in a certain sense, it's not that. So your question is then connected to the more interesting second question, which, let's take the case of India. The only people who remotely, absolutely remotely, have any allegiance to nonviolence is what is called the small people's movements. Whether it's against a dam, whether it's against what Shalini works on, the SEZs, various large-scale enterprises which degrade conventional lives of tribals, minorities, and so on and so forth. It works there. And it faces state power in its absolute brutality in a way which is unimaginable. Or the tribals in central India or whatever they be. It's absolutely confined to the small people's movements. Do they make a difference? If I have to believe Ricker, it would make a difference one day. Maybe one day it will become center stage. It does. You see, I didn't go into the whole of the Ricker essay. Ricker says the problem with violence is that it is continuous, in a certain sense, in one form or the other. Whereas forms of nonviolent resistance are episodic, periodical. They're acts, they burst into significance. And how do I then make it central to the political vocabulary of the time? Rickers's essay has to also be read simultaneously with Rickers's other essay called State and Violence. Because he has a perfect understanding of how the state will not allow any instance of nonviolence to become center stage. And yet you have moments when that guy goes and stands in front of that tank in Tiananmen Square or whatever that be. Nonviolence does become center stage for a moment, a flickering moment. And these are those partially successful acts. Because each time you have the Tiananmen Square massacre anniversary, which is just gone, you would still have a picture that somebody will publish of that man standing in front of the tank. So that's the most I can say at this point of time on that. Are instances of resistance, do they create a chink in the armor of the state? Difficult to say, depends where it is. The Buber question comes in, the conditionality of a situation rather than the unconditionality of the spirit. Where does it come? Current dispensations in Turkey, or I dare not say Hungary, or my own backyard. I don't know whether instances of resistance are even registered. So when people these days tell me write a petition, I often joke, but the guys who receive the petition can't read. I mean, who do you send a petition to? Yeah. Absolutely. This is a question after my heart, because even in the Indian tradition, the word ahimsa is a relatively modern term, and misunderstood for at least 200 years with the old Indology and the Orientalistic inflections on the word. I mean, it's simply seen as the opposite of himsa, which is violence, ahimsa. Whereas it has nothing to do, I mean, the earliest meaning that you have, the classical meaning is wish not to kill, absence of the wish to kill. And the desideratives of the word, again, have only now been recently, by recently I mean in the last 30 years, resolved. But there is something interesting. The earliest meaning of ahimsa so again, I'm sorry to be pedantic, but so till now, anything that was from the Vedas, say, roughly, to the epics was called the classical period. Now Indologists have said, no, the Vedic period is the pre-classical period, the Upanishadic period is the classical period, and there is by and large a consensus on this. But in the pre-Upanishadic period, that is the period of the period prior to the metaphysical texts, the original meaning of ahimsa was not the wish to kill, but security, safeness, almost verging on the Greek eudaimonia, welfare, well-being. And you have the roots, whereas there are a lot of texts which do not even use the word ahimsa. They use the word adrohana as the opposite of himsa. So there is himsa, and the opposite is adrohana. They don't even use the word ahimsa. But that we go into philological stuff. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. I know very little about Gandhi, but I found the results of what you were talking about to be deeply depressing. It seemed to me that the absence of a response to Buber, as well as to Pollock, is not just a question of Gandhi, it's a question of two universes of understanding not able to communicate. And that Gandhi really cannot respond because it seemed to me, on the basis of what you said, that the understanding of anti-imperialism and the anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggle has no conceptual room for understanding what happened to the Jews in Europe. There's just no conceptual room for that. Just as, in a sense, the traditional left also had no room for it.
Horkheimer's statement about capitalism and the Jews.
Yes,
Yeah.
but that's Horkheimer.
Yeah.
You know, in all of the monuments to murdered Jews in Eastern Europe under communist rule, almost never mention that they're Jews. Mention that they're peaceful Soviet citizens, for example, in Babi Yar. And what you have are these Jews who really want their situation to be recognized. And Gandhi can't. But it's not just a personal failing. There is a whole understanding of the world that has no room for this. And so I found this deeply depressing.
Thank you. No, but I think if I could respond to the first part of your comment and question, when I read Gandhi and Buber, or I read Gandhi and Pollock, it reminds me of an exchange between Russell and Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's gone off on a sulk again to somewhere in Norway, and poor Russell is trying to get him back. But there's a fantastic line in one of the letters where he says, your conception of what science is and what my conception of science is are so divergent that we seem to be sitting side by side in a marsh. Now, I think yes, the universes are different, and hence limits the understanding, in a certain sense, of the Jewish question to an extremely personal, as you said. It's a very personal understanding. But I don't think it is that. I think there is in Gandhi, and if I sort of finish the book, which I must because it's the fourth and the last, all long things must come to an end. It is something to do with the way he approaches religion. And since the wine and cheese is waiting for us, I'll elaborate on that. I mean, it's a very quick one. He says the flaws in any religion are the flaws of the present day, but in its original conception, religion is beautiful. And if one goes only back to the original, all the problems will be solved. So again, a denial of history in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for this rich, also fascinating talk, but I agree with you, it's a very, very depressing talk for me. And I just wanted to quote this one sentence, you quoted the paragraph above. Pollock writes to Gandhi, says, "But as you are a Hindu by birth, an Indian by choice, and a citizen of the world by aspiration, I do adjure you to reflect once more upon the stupidity and the futility of abstention."
Yeah.
And it's...
I sort of had that here, but again, the time constraints. But
yeah,
yeah, I mean,
and
it's so
this is-
beautifully put.
It is. I think it really is the quintessence of this appeal to him, and yet it falls on either deaf ears or at least on the inability to conceive of a response to this from the moral universe which Gandhi inhabits. And I think that is what, for me, the inability of being able to, that's why I asked you again and again, so he doesn't reply to Gordon, he doesn't reply to Pollock, because it really is, there is something
Mayor of New
inexplicable.
York writes, and he doesn't reply to him either.
Yes, there is something really inexplicable, to me at least, with hindsight, one should say. So I don't even know if it's about contradictions. I think there is a chasm here which is so deep that it's difficult to understand where dialogue has failed completely. And so with this very depressing conclusion for the academic year, I would still invite you to come and join us for a glass of wine and cheese. And Jyoti, thank you very much for at least illuminating all the problems and the very serious dilemmas which this little excerpt from a letter has brought us to think about.
Thank you.